In today's video, I want to discuss some trade and free agent rumors surrounding the New York Rangers and Washington Capitals. Plus, we have several more prospect signings and some updates from Elliotte Friedman on what might take place this summer once hockey can resume. We'll jump into the latest news coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned, we have several different types of updates for you today. So let's get started with all the different prospect signings we've seen here since our last video update. We've had quite a slew of these, including junior players turning pro, NCAA free agents, etc. So let's dive right in here. The Florida Panthers have signed a pair of defensemen, including a college free agent from Bowling Green. The Panthers signed left shot defenseman Alec Rauhauser, who played 4 seasons for Bowling Green, putting up 35 points in 38 games in his final campaign. They also signed prospect defenseman Max Gilden, who they had drafted in the 3rd round back in 2017. Of course, he's an American-born defenseman born in Texas, played for the University of New Hampshire for the past 3 or 4 seasons, and is now ready to turn pro and join the Florida Panthers organization. So there's a couple defensive prospects who can likely get started with their AHL affiliate for the coming year. The Minnesota Wild have signed goalie prospect Hunter Jones to an entry-level contract for a 3-year deal. Of course, he's played in the Ontario Hockey League for the Peterborough Petes. He's a big goalie, 6'4", has played pretty solid in the Ontario Hockey League, putting out some pretty solid numbers. He had a 2.75 goals against and a 903 save percentage this past season. He was a 2019 draft selection earlier for the Minnesota Wild, so another very intriguing goalie prospect to get into their system. The Boston Bruins have signed one of the top defensive prospects out of the college hockey scene as well, signing Jack Aucan, who's a 22-year-old prospect defenseman from St. Cloud State University. He seems to have a pretty offensive side to his game, putting up 34 points in 39 games this past season, so another interesting prospect to see how he can do once he joins pro hockey for next year. The Buffalo Sabres have signed 2018 second-round selection Matthias Samuelsson, who's been playing college hockey for the past couple years as well. He's played with the USA team at the World Juniors the past couple times as well, had pretty solid tournaments. Samuelsson hasn't been the most offensive at the tournament, but certainly had some pretty solid games, being relied upon heavily in defensive situations. Playing for Western Michigan University, he's got pretty good size as well. He's a big guy, 6'4", about 218 pounds, so he'll be a welcome addition to the Sabres blue line. We'll see if he can make the jump right to the NHL, or if he might need some more seasoning at the American Hockey League level prior to. The Montreal Canadiens also announced a pair of signings, including defenseman Gustav Olofsson, who they had previously acquired this past season. He signed to another 1-year, 2-way contract. He'll be paid $750K at the NHL level, $250K at the American Hockey League level. The Montreal Canadiens also announced another signing for one of their top prospects, Jesse Ylonen, will join the franchise at the pro level. Ylonen was originally a 2018 second-round selection. The winger played this past year in Liga, 22 points in 53 games. Of course, he was originally born in the States, but he has Finnish heritage as well. Played for Finland, not this past year in 2020, but in the 2019 World Juniors, and had a tremendous tournament, putting up 13 points in 12 games. So Ylonen will be a welcome addition to the pro ranks for the Habs team, who has a very deep prospect pool, likely getting started at the American Hockey League level. Now, as I mentioned as well, we have some updates from Elliotte Friedman concerning what might be taking place for the NHL. They have lots of contingency plans that are being worked on for if and when they can resume their NHL season, or what it's going to take to get that happening here. He mentions that, in his opinion, the best case scenario would be like a mid-July return with some July and August, possibly into September hockey. Not really sure exactly how it would work, if they go right to the playoffs, if all teams would then maybe play 1 or 2 regular season games first. A lot of uncertainty around the draft lottery. Are they going to go by, point percentages, or are they going to be, doing a different format? There's lots of uncertainty, lots of question marks, and certainly more questions than answers right now. But he did confirm that NHL GMs were asked to confirm their building availabilities for August as well. So we very well could see a case where they have July, August hockey, maybe even into September, and then free agency could follow between September and October, depending on exactly when the season would end, and then maybe get the other season started a little bit late, as early as mid-November, and maybe cut down the bye weeks as well as the All-Star game break that they get to kind of condense the season a little bit so it doesn't extend too late into the following summer. As far as the NHL draft goes right now, it's looking more and more likely that it's not going to be held in an arena like we normally have, likely going to be done via phone or video conference or some kind of style in that capacity. So we're not quite clear, obviously, exactly when it's going to be held, because we don't know exactly when the draft order is going to be settled. So that remains another big question mark. as we continue further into this pause part of the NHL season. Now, as I mentioned as well, we have some trade and free agent rumors I want to take a look at, starting with the New York Rangers. Even though they have a situation where they unloaded defenseman Brady Shea at the trade deadline, they still have some big-time contracts to sign this summer, including Tony DeAngelo, and they're going to be tight up against the cap because of all the other contracts they already have in place. Plus, they have some other very interesting young prospects who are going to need big contracts within the next 1 to 2 years as their entry-level deals expire. I mean, obviously, on the blue line, they already have Jacob Trouba, who's got a big-time deal at $8 million. They traded Shea. DeAngelo is likely going to be needing a deal somewhere around $5 to $6 million, depending on the term. Probably going to take $6 million or a little better to get a longer-term deal done, whereas he might be willing to accept a bridge deal 2 to 3 years closer to the $5 million mark. But he's had such tremendous productivity the past 2 years, they really have no choice but to pay him. He is an RFA with arbitration-eligible requirements here, so if they go to arbitration, I don't think there's any way that DeAngelo loses his case, and they likely end up with a short-term deal with paying him big money anyway, which is likely something that they can probably negotiate a better deal without going that route. The Rangers also have quite an extensive history over the last decade of not letting their RFAs make it to arbitration, so we'll see if they can continue that. But they also have other guys like Ryan Strome and Brendan Lemieux that need new deals. They have other younger players like Philip Hedl as well as Adam Fox who are going to, certainly earn big raises coming out of their ELCs over the next 1 or 2 years too. They need some cap flexibility, so some of their older players might have to move on, and some of that might be difficult to do based on the fact that they have no move clauses or a form thereof, which can certainly complicate making a trade. But it could we finally see the exit of Henrik Lundqvist from the Rangers. I know he's made it clear he didn't really want to move on, but seeing as how he was treated near the end of the season before the pause, he was barely playing, oftentimes a healthy scratch. They were usually letting Shesterkin and Georgiev get most of the starts and playing time. So would they prefer to sign Georgiev, who also is another member of that club who needs a new contract, and see if they can find a way for Hank to move on here for the final year of his deal? It's an $8.5 million cap hit for only one season, and they don't want to have one contract for 1 year really complicate, to having to possibly trade one of their younger, brighter stars in their organization. I mean, they also have some guys on defense like Mark Stahl and Brendan Smith who could certainly, probably be moved on as well. There's also that uncertainty around what the NHL will do around the cap, if it is flat or decreased. Could they give the teams compliance buyout like we discussed before? They might be able to get out of one of these contracts a little bit easier in that route if that were to take place. But certainly some very interesting times in New York. This rebuild has moved along quite nicely. They have lots of star young players who are needing big money. And now with guys like DeAngelo and others needing to get paid, who moves on to make the space necessary to make that happen? Or do they end up trading one of their younger players, which is, I'm sure, something they would probably rather not do. For me, I mentioned before, leading into the deadline, before they traded Brady Shea, that maybe DeAngelo would be traded. But at this point, why would you want to trade him? He's been such a productive young defenseman. I would want to sign him longer term and find a way for one of these older guys to move on to create the necessary space to make that happen. Now, speaking of veteran netminders like Lundqvist maybe moving on, the Washington Capitals are in a similar predicament with their salary cap situation. Goaltender Braden Holtby very well could have played his final game as a Capital if the season ends up being canceled. Obviously, if it does resume, he'll be a big part of them trying to win the Stanley Cup one last time here before the time comes. But the odds of him sticking around with the Capitals are extremely unlikely, considering how well young goaltender Ilya Samsonov has played and the type of contract that the 30-year-old Holtby is likely going to be looking for. This very well could be his last big-time deal of his career. He's already 30 years old, so if he can get a 4 or 5 year deal, 6-year deal, something like that with another organization, that very well might be his last big-time contract before his career winds down. So certainly a lot of uncertainty around Holtby. We could very well see some big-time goalies on the free agent market this summer. Obviously, the Capitals have some other question marks around their team as well, including on the blue line. Obviously, newly acquired Brendan Dillon did seem to fit nicely there. And while he was playing after the trade deadline, a guy like Radko Gudas was getting healthy scratched and sat out a fair bit in those last final games before the season came to a suspension here. So, Gudas is also an unrestricted free agent as well as Brendan Dillon. I do think the likelihood, though, that they probably would, at this point, might try to keep Dillon and let Gudas go to free agency. It's hard to say, but they obviously, they both play a very similar style of game. The odds of them both sticking with the Capitals are probably unlikely at this point. but obviously they have a lot of money committed to a lot of other players. There's certainly going to be an interesting case of Alex Ovechkin's contract, who's not too far away from being expired, and how that negotiation to keep him on board will go as well. That's a discussion for another day, but something they have to keep in mind as they plan for the future, especially if the salary cap situation is not going to be going up anytime soon. Obviously, this pause in the season is going to have a big delay and a big impact on a lot of teams here, like the Capitals and others. And goaltenders like Braden Holtby very well might not be able to command as much on the open market as they might have been hoping for. So certainly some big question marks for teams like the Rangers and the Capitals with some of these veteran guys, especially with the salary cap looming over them, maybe not going up, possibly going down. Will they be bought out if they are given extra compliance buyouts? And guys like Holtby, who are already pending free agents anyway, certainly going to increase to the number of players that might be looking for a new home once we finally hit what we're going to call the official offseason for the 1920 season. So, of course, as always, we'll know your thoughts and opinions on everything discussed today. So let me know your thoughts down below and we can continue the conversation. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content, and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it as well. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I will catch you next time.